U.S. President Donald Trump has hosted the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for the second time since returning to office in January. Iran and Gaza were the main topics discussed. Why did the meeting take place and what does it signal? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was back at the White House on Monday, his second trip in just over 2 months. It's not clear why he was so keen to visit Washington again, and his host offered few clues in his trademark rambling addresses. A mostly silent Netanyahu looked on as U.S. President Donald Trump delivered a series of monologues. Planned U.S. talks with Iran about its nuclear program made headlines. The excitement dampened later by Tehran saying the discussions would not be direct. As for the genocide in Gaza, Trump once again spoke of the Strip as an incredible piece of important real estate. Netanyahu chipped in to claim that Israel was not responsible for keeping Palestinians, in his words, locked in Gaza, despite years of blockade and siege. If the Israeli Prime Minister went to the U.S. seeking special tariffs relief, well, he left empty-handed. So why did he travel to Washington, D.C.? And can we learn anything from what the two leaders said about differences or not on Gaza and Iran? We'll ask our panel shortly, but first, this report from Victoria Gatenby.
U.S. President Donald Trump welcoming Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House. Their meeting was expected to focus on two main topics, the war on Gaza and the latest tariffs. But it was the president's comments on Iran that grabbed attention.
We're having direct talks with Iran, and they've started. It'll go on Saturday. We have a very big meeting, and we'll see what can happen. And I think everybody agrees that doing a deal would be preferable to doing the obvious.
During his first term, Trump withdrew the U.S. from the landmark 2015 agreement Iran signed with major world powers. It limited Tehran's nuclear program to civilian use in return for sanctions relief. But in 2018, Trump reimposed sanctions. Tehran in turn suspended some of its commitments under the nuclear deal and increased uranium enrichment. Responding to Trump's comments on Monday, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi denied any direct engagement with Washington. Instead, he confirmed indirect high-level talks will take place in Amman on Saturday. While the two leaders were meeting in Washington, Israeli attacks against Palestinians in Gaza continued with impunity, as they have for the past 18 months. President Trump reiterated his plan to forcibly remove Palestinians from the Strip, and Prime Minister Netanyahu confirmed that talks are underway on crafting a new ceasefire for captives exchange deal.
Steve Witkoff, who's President Trump's very able representative, helped us get a deal that got 25 out. We're working now on another deal that we hope will succeed. And we're committed to getting all the hostages out.
Despite such comments, analysts say a peaceful resolution to Israel's war is looking increasingly unlikely.
What you basically have is an Orwellian rhetoric about how they're still talking about the voluntary relocation out of Gaza, when they, Trump and Netanyahu, are the people who are responsible for making Gaza unlivable. They are talking about it being a dangerous place, but it's only dangerous because they insist on bombing and destroying it, making it unfit for human life.
Israel has blocked all deliveries of food, fuel, medicine and humanitarian aid to Gaza since early March. Palestinians are facing starvation, and help, it appears, is not coming anytime soon. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Okay, let's now bring in our guest. Joining us from Cairo, we have H.A. Hellyer, who's a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, who specializes in global security. In Washington, D.C. is Trita Parsi, the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He specializes in U.S.-Iran relations. Daniel Levy is the President of the U.S. Middle East Project and the former Israeli negotiator, joining us from London. Welcome to you all. Thanks so much for your time. H.A. Hellyer in Cairo, what's your reaction to not only Trump saying that there would be direct negotiations with Iran, according to him, but the way that announcement was made in that type of setting in front of a small pool of reporters with Netanyahu by his side?
Well, thank you for having me on the program, Dareen. Always a pleasure to be here. I think that one has to keep in mind, as far as I know, Trump called for this meeting, which means that Netanyahu went not really knowing what he was going to get himself into. And I think that a very likely reality here is that Trump wanted to announce these indirect talks with Iran, having the Prime Minister of Israel by his side, which would essentially, I won't say immunize or inoculate him from criticism from further on the right, but be able to show to his base that, look, I've even got the Israelis on board here. Because, of course, Netanyahu couldn't object to Trump saying that they were going to have indirect talks with the Iranians. He can't object to anything that Trump says. So I think that the spectacle in that regard was precisely what Trump was looking for, and he got it.
Trita Parsi, we heard reaction from the Iranian foreign minister saying, quote, Iran and the U.S. will meet in Oman on Saturday for indirect high-level talks. It's as much an opportunity as it is a test, and the ball is in America's court. I mean, for Iran, the decision to negotiate or not, of course, is always made at the highest level. What are Iran's calculations, and how do you read what happened at that meeting between Trump and Netanyahu?
I think, first of all, when it comes to the Iranians saying that they want indirect talks, their original position earlier on during the Trump administration was that they very much actually wanted direct talks. But once Trump signed the February 4th memo, which really contradicted what he had said publicly. Publicly, he had talked about how he was only looking to prevent an Iranian nuclear bomb. That was his only red line. He had no interest in regime change. He said nothing about regional issues or about missiles. All of that created optimism on the Iranian side that there was a pathway for a deal, and they wanted direct talks, and they actively sought that. After the memo came out, which changed it, and they talked about dismantling the program, talked about making sure that Iran would cut its relations with many of its regional partners, as well as closing down its missile program, that's when you see the Iranians backtracking. I personally think that the meeting on Saturday likely will begin indirectly, but by the afternoon, it will be direct talks, because I don't see why the Iranians would send their senior diplomat, their top diplomat, their foreign minister to Oman simply for indirect talks. I think that they have enough of a basis to believe that the parameters of the talks will be such that it will be acceptable to them, and as a result, they themselves will agree sometime during that day to escalate this or elevate this towards direct conversations.
Daniel, is this what Netanyahu wanted to hear, or what do you think is going on here? I mean, many people say, look, it's Netanyahu who is really pushing the war narrative, right, when it comes to Iran. So, and also, does this then make the possibility of a strike in Iran now unlikely, which also many say Netanyahu is seeking?
Well, I don't think there is now, nor has there been, an agreement that the US could reach with Iran, which of course requires Iranian sign-on as well, that Netanyahu would look kindly upon, that would be acceptable to Netanyahu. It's in some ways similar to a ceasefire in Gaza. Lots of differences, but in that respect, he simply doesn't want a deal. He wants the continuation of his hostility. But of course, those situations are very different when it comes to US equities at stake and US interests in terms of the potential for direct American involvement. So I think Netanyahu has not gotten where he wants to be on the US-Iran track, but he would probably look at this and say it's early days, and there's a value to him being in Washington, as the Prime Minister of Israel and as Netanyahu specifically, he has plenty of points of influence, points of access with a Trump administration. And perhaps there were people in the Trump administration who want to make some quite bellicose points with regard to Iran and would rather have those in the mouths of an Israeli prime minister. And therefore, it would be convenient for those people to have Netanyahu in town at this delicate moment.
Look, Daniel, just talk to us also about how you see the optics of all of this, because Netanyahu left Budapest for Washington on Sunday. It was a hastily kind of scheduled White House meeting. He flew about what I understand 250 miles longer than his original route, of course, trying to avoid these countries that may subject him to the ICC arrest warrant. I mean, what does this all indicate to you? And add to that, just forgive me, that there was supposed to be a press conference scheduled between the two men, and that was called off.
We've gone to a slightly better place in the fact that there's not total impunity, that you have to take this circuitous route as an Israeli prime minister by air when you have an ICC arrest warrant against you. But I don't want to make too much of that. Minor bump in the road, minor inconvenience. The absence of a press conference, I don't read anything into. It just creates a more controlled environment when you have a press spray with less people in the room. And let's face it, they took as long to talk there as they would have in any press conference. I don't know what the genesis of this visit was, what was driving it. For Prime Minister Netanyahu, any opportunity to be next to the president in a convivial environment, showing their closeness, getting that praise from the president is a win back home. But he does not get what he hoped to get on tariffs. He does not get the kind of alignment on Iran that we were just talking about, but he does get something that is perhaps most important for him. Even more important than Iran when it comes to domestic Israeli politics. He gets a chance to again make his case on Gaza. He gets the continued green light for the horrendous destruction, the killing, the genocidal actions that are taking place in Gaza. And he gets the reminder of that real estate magnate talk when it comes to how Gaza is being discussed. He has his own authority now established to try and promote the displacement of Palestinians. And maybe we'll talk Gaza a little bit in a moment, Dareen.
We are going to talk Gaza actually right now, and I'll put that to H.A. Hellyer. Trita, I'll come to you in just 1 second, Trita. Let me just cross over to H.A. Hellyer. Were you any clearer on the U.S. and or the Israeli agenda going forward when it comes to Gaza?
So I think Daniel's absolutely right. When it comes to Gaza, Netanyahu was able to stand or sit down, as it were, in the White House and say very clearly that he agrees with the Riviera Plan. Trump still talks about the Riviera Plan. It's become very mainstream within Israeli politics, not simply within the government, which talks about it a lot, but also more widely than that. The notes of divergence I thought were interesting, but not on Gaza. The notes of divergence, for example, took place when it came to Turkey. Trump obviously talking very enthusiastically about Erdogan, which would not have made Netanyahu particularly happy, particularly considering Erdogan has actually called him a Nazi. When it came to Syria, that the lines of convergence were not particularly clear. Trump said, any problem you have with the Turks, I can help sort out as long as you're reasonable. And, I think it says a lot about where we're at. When Donald Trump tells Netanyahu, you've got to be reasonable. Of course, when it came to tariffs, just as what was said earlier, Netanyahu didn't get what he wanted. There are a number of points of divergence here that I don't think will make any difference, unfortunately, to what's happening in Gaza, which is, the biggest problem that we face right now. But there are points of divergence nonetheless. Okay,
Trita, I had cut you off. You tried to say something. Go ahead, please, and then I'll ask you about Gaza.
It was part of what I was going to say was just said and put very well. And what I just wanted to emphasize is I don't think there was any expectations that there would be divergence on Gaza. That was not up for grab, unfortunately. I would have loved to have seen Trump do a 180 on his position on Gaza. But there was no basis to believe that any shift at all actually were going to happen. What was up for grabs was whether Trump would side with Netanyahu on Turkey. He didn't. Whether he would adopt the Israeli position on the nuclear talks, which is dismantlement, he didn't. Instead, he's sending Witkoff over to negotiate. And despite the nice words that Netanyahu used to describe Witkoff, the Israelis have been trying to get Witkoff fired. And they want to get rid of him. And they know very well, because Witkoff represents actually an effort to do a verification-based deal with Iran, which is, again, what the JCPOA was, rather than the dismantlement that the Israelis have been pushing for. So he got nothing on that either. And he got nothing on the other thing that was up for grabs, which was the tariffs. So I think on the basis of what he could have gotten, he got nothing. On the one thing that he got something, he already had it, and no change was expected.
What is it surprising, Trita, to you that Trump made no mention of the latest Israeli attack on the ambulance and the paramedic workers, killing 15 of them in Gaza, as well as, the endless strikes that we've been seeing over the past few days targeting women, children, and others in the Gaza Strip?
Unfortunately not. It is unfortunately not surprising that Trump would not have mentioned that at all. What we have seen that started already under the Biden administration was that the United States have essentially taken off all limits, all constraints on the Israelis. They can essentially do whatever they want. And during Biden, there would only be whispers about how upset Biden is privately about this, but nothing would have been done in terms of leverage or pressure to change the course of the Israelis. And clearly under Trump, that's not going to happen. Even the false complaints or faint complaints are not happening now either.
Daniel, is this then a prime minister unleashed, if I can use that word? If Trump is not putting any sort of constraints on him, is he now able to do whatever he wants, not only in Gaza, but in other countries in the region, Lebanon, Syria, and others?
Yeah, Dareen, the leash was pretty loose, wasn't it, as Trita has just reminded us. But you've taken the incredibly promiscuous environment for war crimes that was encouraged under the Biden administration, and you've gone that step further. And we see that in terms of the return to the war crimes of starvation that are being imposed in Gaza. We see that in terms of what's happening in the West Bank. We see that, as you say, in terms of the way Israel is really acting as a revisionist power, a danger to pretty much everyone in the region. And we should expect that to continue under Trump. There may be a caveat, and the caveat is why we saw a Gaza ceasefire in the first place. Trump may, and he hinted at this yesterday, he may see a benefit in getting those Israelis who are being held in Gaza out and bringing some kind of closure on that. At the moment, he is not acting to do so. And so what you saw in this grotesque reference, you see a Trump who has no exposure to the crimes being committed against Palestinians, no exposure to Palestinian voices. When he talks about Gaza, he says we have a hostage problem. Not a 2 million people facing starvation, the 50,000, 60,000 deaths there. He talks about real estate. He talks about Israel having owned Gaza. They never owned Gaza. They illegally occupied Gaza. So what you have, and I kind of feel we have to go here, Dareen, it shouldn't surprise us that when someone is coming from a real estate magnate mindset and from a settler colonial mindset, and Trump is bringing both of those things to the table, they look at Gaza through dollar signs. These are people who have an alienation from their environment in every sense of the term, and they simply cannot understand the notion of a people rooted in their land, indigenous to their land, who have a connection to that land, who are part of that, the rootedness. And that these aren't people who you let rot fester, you let rats fester, and they'll, be scurrying out and looking for somewhere else to go. That connection is something that they will not and cannot understand. And it's part of the unrealistic approach of both the Israelis and the Americans, because I don't think Israel will succeed in this, but unfortunately, Palestinians will suffer a lot along the way. But you will also have this division, this polarization inside Israel, not necessarily over the well-being of Palestinians, but what Israel will have to do to make good on these very far-reaching and, of course, deeply criminal and inhumane plans.
H.A. Hellyer, do you agree with what Daniel is saying? And also, if we just maybe look at what could be going on behind the scenes for a moment. Before this meeting with Netanyahu and Trump, Trump held a call with the French president, the Egyptian president, as well as the Jordanian king, right? And the discussion there was about Gaza. We also know that Netanyahu on Monday, while he was in the U.S., met with Steve Witkoff, the envoy, to discuss efforts, if there are any efforts, when it comes to sort of what he called an updated ceasefire proposal. So could there be something going on behind the scenes right now when it comes to Gaza and a ceasefire?
So in reference to what you asked me to begin with, I think that there's a larger issue here with regards to how Palestinians and also as Arabs and as part of, the broader quote-unquote Muslim world, are how they're discussed in the context of American policymaking. And what we've seen over the past 18 months is an incredible dehumanization of what Palestinians actually represent, and an acceptance of that dehumanization really across the board. When Donald Trump attacks Chuck Schumer by calling him a Palestinian, I think that just says it all. I think it tells you what he thinks of Palestinians as a people. And it's not then surprising that he wouldn't regard them as having the right to self-determination or autonomy on their land, because they're essentially nomads. It's very similar, for example, to the language that you would have seen about Native Americans in the United States 100 years ago. And actually, I think people really should, draw these sorts of parallels because I think that they apply even more so than the Bantustan comparison in South Africa. So I think that really explains a lot of how policy relates to Palestinians from at least a particular generation of American politician and policymaker. And that's not obviously just in the Trump administration, but much further back than that. I would like to think that there is this imperative of, quote unquote, making a deal, which is what led to the Witkoff proposal being taken up in the first place. Of course, it wasn't called the Witkoff proposal, but it was essentially Witkoff going and really pulling people's arms and saying, no, we're going to have a ceasefire hostage deal, phase one begin right now. But that imperative, I think, is gone. I think Trump wanted that in January. And the stars aligned for that, as it were. I don't think there's any such imperative for that right now. The whole reason why we didn't get into phase two of the deal was because the imperative was done. A deal had been signed, and you can't trade the desire to continue with that deal going up against a huge amount of opposition. There would have been a lot of opposition within the Republican base on basically strong-arming the Israelis to go into phase two, when it was clear the Israelis never wanted to go into phase two. They never had the intention of going into phase two. They didn't fulfill everything in phase one. The Philadelphia corridor, for example, was never withdrawn from. Different types of materials were not allowed into Gaza that should have been allowed into Gaza. They didn't begin the negotiations in good faith with the proper type of negotiation delegation. So, not all of that was extremely clear quite early on. Right. And I don't think that that's changed. I don't see any signs that that's going to be any different over the coming period. On the contrary, the Riviera plan is what the default is now. Okay,
Trita, look, H.A. Hellyer was just talking about making a deal. I mean, ever since, even during his first term as well as his second term, Trump has always stated that he wants to make these historic peace deals, right? And since his re-election in November, he's been supportive of reaching some sort of nuclear agreement with Iran. But then you have his administration, right? And the rhetoric that comes out of the administration isn't so positive. Does that send sort of mixed signals about U.S. diplomatic intentions?
Absolutely. And this is part of the hesitation that has existed in Iran towards the Trump administration. Towards the end of his first administration, there were actually a few efforts, initiatives by the Iranians to put forward proposals to negotiate with Trump. Early on, they committed a huge mistake. They completely shunned any contact with the administration and insisted that he had to live up to all of the commitments of the JCPOA or go back into it after he left in order for there to be any negotiations. And in retrospect, that was a mistake because Trump wanted to renegotiate the deal. He just went about it in a very clumsy way. The Iranians missed that opportunity. So towards the end, they tried. But those efforts were sabotaged by the people around Trump, primarily Pompeo and Bolton. Yes. And the concern that existed in regards to Trump this time around was that even if he wants a deal, and even if the Iranians are legitimately and genuinely convinced that Trump actually wants a deal, it doesn't matter if he is surrounded by people who don't want the deal and who have the capacity of undermining and sabotaging Trump's own efforts. And this is part of the picture now we also have seen with the power struggle within the administration, with some of the more pro-diplomacy elements versus Tim Walz, the national security advisor, who is the most hawkish person in the White House right now, has been diminished as a result of Signalgate. And the result so far seems to have been that his line, which is identical more or less to Israel's line, which is dismantlement, appears not to have been adopted by Trump.
Daniel, final word for you. I see you nodding along with what Trita had to say from Washington. And I know we're getting into this sort of realm of speculation here, but if there was some sort of deal or a positive step forward between the Iranians and the United States, will that then reflect on the ground in other parts of the region?
Well, first of all, I think Netanyahu knows that in the room, if there are direct talks, the Americans will face an interlocutor far more familiar with the material, with the file, just as happened when the other envoy, Bola, was in the room with Hamas. They will get schooled. But he also knows that there's a long way from that to getting a deal. And he is not a passive bystander in trying to prevent a deal. He is part of that effort to get America to revert to type, whatever it is we're talking about, Iran or Gaza, and he has tremendous capacity to do so, but not unlimited capacity. Of course, if there is a deal, I think he would then try to unravel that, because that does have far-reaching implications. That's why they try to unravel the deal. It would make Israel even more of an outlier, an Israel that seeks a region permanently on a war footing in a region which prefers not to be thus. And so what you have with Netanyahu is a different dynamic in the following way. He knew how to manage and lead Biden, and that was a comfort zone for him. He's not entirely sure how to do that with Trump. Therefore, he wants to avoid being in that position, whether it's Iran or Gaza. And look, we will see how that plays out. On Gaza, if I may, I would just say that I do not think that we're going to see the resilience of the Palestinian people suddenly disappear. And I do not think we're going to see the armed resistance suddenly wave the white flag. That's not how this is going to end. So we're left with, will Trump weigh in? Will the internal vulnerabilities and differences inside Israel have an impact? Or will we see others belatedly step in and create another vector of leverage, in particular in the region itself, which hasn't happened thus far?
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us, H.A. Hellyer, Trita, Parsi, and Daniel Levy. We appreciate your time. Thank you. Thanks for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on X. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.